Okay, I think now is the time to begin. Hello and welcome to New Directions East Asia 2021. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. Our next session is entitled Topic Relevance, Authentic Engagement and Task Completion in Spoken Performance. And the presenters are Judith Fairbairn and Dylan Burton. Judith leads assessment development projects for the British Council's Global Assessments team, which includes assessment design, item writing, test quality assurance, project management, and bespoke assessment solutions for clients. Dylan is a PhD candidate in the Second Language Studies program at Michigan State University and has published articles in the Language Assessment Quarterly system and the Routledge Handbook of Second Language Acquisition and Language Testing. If you have any questions in this session for the presenters, please type them into the chat box. We'll hopefully have around 10 minutes at the end of the session where the presenters will be able to address these questions. I'm now going to hand over to our presenters. Judith and Dylan, please start sharing your screen and begin when you're ready.
Great, thank you. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and hello from the UK and the US, and thank you for inviting us to present today. Dylan and I are PhD students working in similar areas of spoken language assessment. It's really motivating to have this opportunity to present our ideas and research. Hopefully, we can also make some contact with people working in this area. We were colleagues for a number of years at the British Council and studied similar topics for our MAs in language testing. We both have an interest in the part of the speaking assessment that is difficult to quantitatively measure, such as topic relevance, authentic engagement, and task completion. Today, we will talk about this part of the speaking construct. We'll speculate and give our thoughts for the future with reference to our own research. In general proficiency speaking assessment, we normally measure performance using a test task. There are two approaches to measure spoken performance. We can use human raters to assess performance using a rating scale, or we can use machine scoring. Psycholinguistic language proficiency, such as fluency, grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation, is well understood and can be measured. However, language is social and interactive, and we want our spoken assessments to test authentic speech as much as possible. But as we make spoken performance tasks more authentic, the construct being measured increases. We are no longer just measuring the psycholinguistic language ability. Instead, we are measuring other areas of language proficiency, such as topic relevance, authentic engagement, and task completion. Human rating and machine scoring may perceive the performance in these other areas as successful or unsuccessful, and these decisions could impact on test taker results. So what does it mean for a test task to be perceived as successful, for a test performance to be perceived as successful? What does success look like? What is the range of success? Can we study human rating in these other areas and then transfer this understanding to machine scoring decisions? Do we want the machine to mark like a human, or are we dealing with two different constructs?
All right, so in order to really understand about these constructs and what machines and humans are rating, we need to backtrack a little bit and discuss really the fundamental issue. What are the constructs for speaking tests? So let's try to unpack this a little bit. Most language tests at the moment implicitly or explicitly sort of rely on a model that's psycholinguistic. In other words, language is made up of both knowledge, for example, lexis, grammar and phonemes, and also processing, fluency. This is understood to reside within the individual. In tests, it's tested discretely. That is, without taking into account the impact of other people taking the test or external factors. However, we know that language is embedded in social uses from the communicative language movement. And the most famous model of these is perhaps still Bachman and Palmer's from '96. Language is contextualized in its environment in these models. Some tests may take into account organizational skills, or, for example, sociolinguistic appropriacy, such as register. And this is particularly true in writing tests. Some tests may focus on strategic competence, for example, paraphrasing, especially when it's taken into account in a developmental continuum in terms of acquisition. But models of communicative competence are descriptive. They describe language sort of in a static way, not across different levels. And they're not always the most appropriate for describing language as it's developing in an acquisitional process, because they leave out sort of that processing component from these models. Now, proficiency may furthermore be made up of different components at different levels. Hulstein made a case that proficiency is made up of both basic language cognitive components and higher language cognitive components. What this means is that basic language cognitive components make up the core of what language use and processing are, and higher language cognitive components form those extra things that not everyone is expected to do. So as an example, let's think about first language speakers, right? In first languages, we have individuals that may be illiterate in their first language, but they're able to communicate with everyone around them. They can get things done with a language. They can make use of the language. And so their basic language cognition is sort of considered to be the same as any other first language speaker of that language. There's sort of a core competence there. And so individuals differ in their first language and their higher language cognitive components because that involves reading and writing in different academic language and sort of differing world knowledge and problem solving abilities. And this is definitely the case with second language speakers, except that second language speakers are going to differ in their basic language cognitive proficiency as they go along a developmental continuum. But they may share higher language cognitive components from the beginning, so it's more difficult to define. We also use language differently depending on the context. In a broad sense, for example, in general language use, when we use language in normal situations, we're relying on basic language cognitive components when we communicate. And that's really what we do throughout most of our day. We're not relying on academic language or organizing complex discourse. And we can consider language assessment itself as a subset of the language and functions that we find in normal life, and test tasks an even smaller subset of that. So each context is likely going to be drawing on different cognitive aspects of proficiency. And we believe that as contexts get more and more narrow, what we're going to see are individuals are going to be drawing on those higher language cognitive components of proficiency, the academic language and the problem solving skills, more and more than in general contexts.
So what do humans assess when rating spoken performance? There are three areas that humans assess when rating spoken performance: fluency. Well, the first one is the psycholinguistic language proficiency that Dylan described earlier. The second area is the higher level cognitive skills, such as register or ability to synthesize information, which he's also discussed. The third area is communicative adequacy or effectiveness, and we're using those words interchangeably today. Studies in this third area have focused on raters' perceptions of test takers' communicative adequacy or effectiveness and compared these qualitative judgments to quantitative measures such as language complexity, accuracy, and fluency. So, for example, how many errors, number or types of pausing, for example, things that can be measured. The goal in this research has been to help determine which quantitative elements contribute most to communicative adequacy or effectiveness decisions by raters. So, for example, McNamara found that communicative effectiveness is mostly determined by grammar and expression, but that appropriateness adds variance. Prefontaine and Kormos noted that fluency impression is made up of both measurable temporal elements and impressions of engagement. Pelotti defines communicative adequacy as the degree to which a test the degree to which a learner's performance is successful in achieving a task goal efficiently. While Reves et al. Define communicative adequacy in how test takers respond to the expectation of what to say and how to say it. Psycholinguistic language proficiency accounts for about 75% of the variance in language proficiency and communicative success. This could be considered the decontextualized and core basic cognition level of language competency. It can be measured using narrow, atomistic, or weak rating scale criteria that focuses on the language knowledge and the processing aspects that Dylan noted earlier. But for test task success, there are additional areas that need to be assessed in a fully contextualized, outer core, higher level competency. The rating scale criteria is broader and stronger. It's this test task success, this area on the top right, that we are investigating. So based on the literature and our own research, we believe that the construct in human speech assessment is that of a communicative effectiveness. We see communicative effectiveness as being made up of two main elements: the language proficiency that we talked about earlier, and also this idea of a test task success. So language proficiency makes up most of the test taker's score and includes the knowledge and the processing, the psycholinguistic elements, fluency, pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary that we discussed. Whereas the test task success area makes up a smaller portion of the test taker's score and includes task completion. So did the test taker do what was expected? Coherence, such as structure and logic, and sociolinguistic appropriacy, such as register and pragmatics. So our research areas are in brown at the bottom, which we hope to feed into this model of communicative effectiveness.
All right, now we'd like to present some of our own findings and how we believe that our findings sort of fit within this research paradigm. So in a study that I conducted as part of my MA thesis, I looked into an aspect of test tasks that's called engagement. And in this case, engagement refers to cognitive aspects of performance. In other words, whether someone is perceived as using similar thinking patterns as one would find in sort of a general type of language situation. And this came out of concerns that test takers were relying on memorization or practicing before a test. And so during the test, they weren't really communicating in a way that would be authentic in a normal situation. What I found was that engagement was sort of made up of 4 key qualities. And those qualities are here in the center circle: spontaneity, genuineness, scriptedness, and naturalness. And that those decisions that human raters were making to perceive engagement were made up of a bunch of different qualities that we can see here to the right. So for example, the truthfulness of the response, the orientation to the task prompt, and the degree to which the test taker was trying to control the test situation and their language. Basically, what this means is that if someone was found to be orienting heavily towards the test or the task more than communication, this impacted whether the person was seen to be drawing from real life language processing in the moment. If you'd like to read more about my findings in this study, I've got a link at the end of the presentation. I found that test task engagement, however, was not the same as language proficiency from ratings from the raters. The two constructs, they correlated at 0.4, which is not unexpected, but that shows sort of 15% shared variance between the two. In other words, that these language scores of proficiency were being influenced by engagement. I also found that test task engagement did not relate strongly to whether the test taker was being seen as on or off topic. In other words, some test takers, they were off topic completely during the prompt, but they were perceived as trying to genuinely communicate in that situation. And also vice versa, that some test takers were on topic, but they were seen to be relying on memorized or non-spontaneous speech. So based on these findings, I hypothesized that perceptions of engagement may be factoring into that extra bit of variance that we saw from the studies that Judith mentioned. And again, there's another paper here if you want to read more about the quantitative findings from this study.
So here's a brief overview of my PhD work in progress. I'm looking at raters' perceptions of on-topic spoken performance. So if I can identify how raters measure the on-topic construct, it might contribute to better training and better rating. And if we understand what raters are doing, we could use this information for better machine scoring systems. So briefly starting from the left-hand side, I'm finding that there are task prompt and task version or task form effects. For example, one question in my study asks the test taker how they feel about an event or activity in the past. So what is a feeling? So what does it actually mean to feel something about something? There are actually two definitions for to feel. So the first is to experience something physical or emotional. And the second is to have a particular opinion about or attitude towards something. So is there a difference between a physical or emotional reaction and an opinion or attitude? Some writers in the study did not consider the second definition as being on topic. Test taker responses such as, I thought, blah, 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 were not considered to be a feeling in some cases. There were also cases where the rater reported something that actually wasn't a feeling. So I'm also finding clear patterns on the depth, detail, and clarity of response that raters expect. There's also sometimes an overlap between clarity of response and pronunciation and fluency decisions. I've also found 5 different approaches raters use to find the evidence for a response being on topic. So some raters report no specific evidence. So they just say something like the response was clear. The second one is some report a short quote of 1 or 2 words that directly links to the prompt. So for example, how did you feel about it? Happy, and they just put happy as their evidence, 1 word that they've taken from the test taker's response. Some raters report extensive quotes of a sentence or 2 to put the evidence into context, which is probably unrealistic in fast-moving or live testing situations, but it was one way of collecting the evidence. Some raters report an interpretation of what the test taker has said, so they reformulate what the test taker has said in their response. And there were some raters who used a lot of implied or inferred meaning as evidence. So they sort of imagine what the test taker meant to say. I also analyzed the reliability and validity of rater decisions. So did the rater use the same decision-making process for each decision, regardless of the task prompt or version? And was the decision valid and measuring the on-topic construct? I also looked at rater severity and leniency and fit statistics, as well as the impact of the rating scale criteria on the decisions. So I found one rater who had an average severity across their CEFR scoring and their on-off topic decisions across versions and prompts as being average. So there was just 1 case of severe. So they were neither severe nor a lenient rater. They were very average compared to the sample. They didn't misfit or overfit in their decisions. So they are consistent raters and also using the full rating scale criteria. Their qualitative analysis also was consistently thorough and predictable. They consistently used the prompt words and used examples or quotes from the test taker's response, and it was short quotes as well. So we could use this rater's decision-making process as part of our rater training to help raters fine-tune this part of their decision-making process.
All right, so what does this mean for going back to the original argument of this entire paper, sort of this push and pull between human and machine assessment? Well, humans are social. They interact with each other and they perceive different aspects of behavior from each other. For this reason, we believe that sort of any attempt to equate human and machine scoring may sort of fundamentally be flawed in that sense. Machines are able to focus really well on individual psycholinguistic aspects of speech. And, with some parts that might not be so good, but then other parts where they're able to detect some aspects of on or off topic nowadays a little bit. But for the most part, machines do this really well. And we believe that these two types of ratings, or scoring in this sense, maybe not rating for machines, although they're founded on the same principles and sort of they're founded on the same psycholinguistic aspect of proficiency, they reflect differing constructs. Machine scoring may be appropriate for measuring, for example, basic language cognitive skills really well. And human scores may be more appropriate for higher language cognitive components that, that really tap into that socially embedded nature of communication. So for this reason, we think that human scores shouldn't be the gold standard for machine scoring. But I would also like to mention here, this goes back to the reliability paradox. Do we want our measurements to be more and more reliable? If we do, we can rely on machine scores, but we do so at the risk of narrowing the construct in this sense. Or do we demonstrate more evidence of construct coverage that we find in general language use domains? In other words, how humans actually use language. If we broaden the construct, we rely on humans, and then at the loss of reliability, we broaden the scope to include aspects of task success. So perhaps hybrid approaches are the best solution. More research needs to be done. But human rated test scores need to be better understood is basically our argument in this paper. In terms of communicative effectiveness and what it means for humans to provide a score to a test, and also the relationship with test task success. Some tests, such as aptness, definitely include test task success in their rubrics and also aspects of being on topic, but it's unknown how task design, task prompts, and rating scope criteria might interact to create differing impressions of what's successful. And we saw that with Judah's study, that there does seem to be an interaction. Furthermore, oral proficiency interviews and paired and group tests definitely present challenges for defining success, because success is going to be co-created and co-constructed by the different interactants in that test. So given that notions of communicative effectiveness might be implicit, it's critical to understand the different constituent parts of it, such as engagement or topic relevance, and how they might impact test scores. That really leads us to ask whether raters can even be trained to identify some of these aspects. I mean, in my study, definitely found that they did pick up on engagement. In Judah's study, they do pick up on topic relevance. But if they can be trained, can they do so reliably? There's some evidence that maybe not, maybe they can. But if they are, a training program needs to be put together so that raters can actually do this reliably and well. So these are questions that really need to be resolved in the future. You know, if these aspects of engagement and relevance impact scores, how do we define that impact, and how do we parse it out? And if we can do so, perhaps we can use machine learning to tap into some of those socially embedded aspects of communication. And maybe one day the two constructs will converge a little bit more. So thank you all for coming. We've got a slide of our references here. We'll provide our PDFs afterwards. If you would like to access either of my studies, I'm happy to send you PDFs of the two if you don't have access through your institution. And yeah, feel free to contact us here at our email addresses. So thank you very much. And yeah, give us some questions.
Thank you, Dylan, and thank you, Judith, for that wonderful presentation. So yes, we have 7 minutes remaining for any questions from the audience. So please feel free, type away into the chat box any questions that you'd like to ask. I noted Cheryl had mentioned that she felt it was interesting that some raters operationalize such a narrow definition of feeling. Do you find that interesting as well, you two?
Yeah, that was specifically in Judah's study. You want to
Sorry,
take that?
trying to unmute myself. I don't use Zoom very often, so I'm just trying to find the mute button. Yeah, no, it was really, I mean, it seems like just such a small thing, but it's really been quite fascinating for me to discover this, because I actually had to look it up in the dictionary, because I was actually, well, what is a feeling? Like, you know, what does that actually mean? And I hadn't actually appreciated that there was more than one definition. And And it made me realize, now keep in mind that I've chosen a specific sample to stretch the raters so that they really give, like they go to the limits of their on topic, off topic. So I'd say like 99% of the time, it's really clear if it's on topic or off topic. And I was purposely choosing things that were ambiguous because I wanted to see if there were any differences. But yeah, it was I found it even more interesting, people who described feelings that I didn't think was a feeling. And so I'm going back to that and thinking, well, is it a feeling or am I wrong? So it's a really interesting area. I'm just writing that up now, actually. So I'll be happy to share sort of the final draft of that with everybody, in due course.
I have a question I'd like to ask. So specifically talking about you two who are involved in this research, what needs to be done going forward with this? And what would you two like to be doing in the coming months or year or so? Which direction would you like to take in research purposes?
Well, for me, I mean, I'm really, really interested in a hybrid model. I'm really interested in seeing, like, there's two kinds of hybrid models. There's the one hybrid model where you have the machine doing what it does really well and it does reliably the same thing every time. Of course, you have to worry about the bias and that it's been programmed properly and all that. But there are some things that the machine can do really well. And then there are other things that the humans do much better than the machine at the moment. And so a hybrid model of bringing those two together would be really interesting. And then comparing sort of the scoring between the two and seeing, where are the differences? So that they're sort of like separating them, that they're marking different things, or having them mark everything and then seeing where the differences are. I find that to be really an interesting way forward. But I expect that we'll have a hybrid system for a number of years, except for very low stakes testing, or as Dylan mentioned earlier, if you're just measuring the psycholinguistic, very, very basic language, but you have to, I guess what it is for people who are buying tests is just to understand what is it that you care about. I mean, are you okay with just a really narrow bit being measured, and that's okay if that's what you're just clear that that's what the test is able to test. But yeah, what about you, Dylan?
No, I agree with you. I think that this is so complex at the moment that a hybrid model is really the only model that can capture really capture what scores mean and provide an appropriate interpretation for test score users without narrowing the construct too much. Barry we've got a couple of minutes, but Barry's got an interesting question here in the chat. He asks, psycholinguistic versus interactional competence. Do we have any idea about the balance between the two in achieving communicative success? And I think in this case, this is where context is gonna change the amount of variance that comes from different factors. If we have a test that requires lots of interactional skills, for example, paired or group tasks, or some sort of role play where a problem has to be solved, I would imagine that these interactional aspects of language are going to play a much larger role in the variance in test scores. Interactional competence, of course, does play a role in oral proficiency interviews, but I think that the impact is going to be less in that context simply because the format is more controlled and more institutionalized. But it's definitely an interesting question. Research has definitely shown that interactional competence and language proficiency are related. They're also not the same. There are just so many components of a test score from a human, and that's really what we're getting at here, is that it's important to try to parse out these extra sources of variance. So, but thank you, Barry, for the question, and Jonathan for your question.
Perhaps time for one more question, I'm thinking. Dylan, do you want to choose? You've got Nick or Ujar's question.
Let me see. Nick says, there's something, I think a number of embedded or planned hybrid models use, that flags are raised when there is a certain discrepancy between machine and human marking, as this helps the auto rater learn as well as providing fair assessment. Yeah, that's true.
And later he says, regarding IC, you need tasks first, which elicit dialogic samples. Most are asymmetrical, even if dialogic, as we all know. Nick, these are fantastic words you're using. I'm struggling reading that. But Ujad does ask one actual question here. This is to Judith. She's just wondering how raters for actors are trained on how to give judgment on or off topics.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind also that the on-off topic is a small part of the rating scale. They're also marking on, grammar, fluency, pronunciation, etc. So it's a small part, and they mark holistically. So it's yeah, well, actually, that's the reason I started the PhD, because I used to manage the raters, and they would say, well, how do you know it's on topic? And I would just kind of look at them and say, well, you just sort of know, don't you? You're like, and then I realized I looked at the literature and there was nothing there to actually explain how you know. So what I'm doing now with the examiner manager is kind of planning to put together a little bit of a training for the examiners about this area. But we have to be really careful, because we don't want to the training has to, one thing I have learned is that when you're training examiners, you have to do it very, very carefully and really think through what you're saying. So I think that in the new year, that will be our project.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the session. And as Jamie suggested in the chat, please feel free to continue this discussion in one of the chat rooms in our communities tab. And if you can, please leave us some feedback on this particular session by answering the 2 short survey questions just to the right side of the video. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you again, Judith and Dylan, great presentation. And I hope you all continue to enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Okay, bye.
Thanks.